Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Halley. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. How you doing, Galen? What's up?
Hey, man, just you're urging try jujitsu for the first time. So
Hey, Jiu-Jitsu. That's awesome, man. Did you get choked? Did you do some choking?
just some basic walking stuff, man. So,
Okay,
now
that
that
is where it starts.
now that
And
we're podcasting and doing jujitsu, I feel uncomfortably close to Joe Rogan. And
I mean, it also describes me from, some number of years ago. I was going to say, before too long, your wardrobe will be filled with tight spandex that smells really bad. So watch out
wow.
for that. Something to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that in the slightest. But
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get to international relations now that we've run through that. Let's see. We try to do a good job on this show, right? And we occasionally get things wrong. We wanted to start with a correction from last week.
Which by we he means I. Two great life lessons I learned in grad school. One, beautiful thing to change your mind, not a weakness, to strength. Two, when you get something wrong, be sure to admit it. I definitely got something wrong last week, and I'm sure some of my students will experience some Schadenfreude, given what a stickler I am about doing reading closely. Not sure how I screwed this up, but last week I mentioned these negotiations prior to World War One between the United States and Greenland, and I said that, between the United States and Denmark, and I was saying
Mhm.
that Denmark had been looking to sell Greenland. That was not correct. Like I said, not sure how I misread it, but that was a US proposal. And
Ah,
in fact, what ultimately ended up leading to a resolution of the issue, I mentioned the United States bought from Denmark what is now the US Virgin Islands. Part of what Denmark got in return for that was actually assurances, which are still binding on the United States, that it would respect Denmark's role in Greenland. So the exact language from Secretary of State Robert Lansing at the time was the United States of America will not object to the Danish government extending their political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland. So I hope that clears things up.
it
And
does clear things
sorry,
up.
sometimes we make mistakes.
No, it's very good to go back over that stuff. And that language is interesting because it should still be in force, and the Trump administration has been ignoring it, which is kind of the problem we were talking about last time, right?
Yeah,
So
there was a good summary of it, by the way, in the New York Times. They had a quote from Trump. I'm paraphrasing. It's not going to be exactly, but something to the effect of like, yeah, I don't have any use for international law.
he's
So
made that abundantly clear. And he's, to be clear, not the first American president to say that or something like it, but he is the most recent and the one who's in office. So cool. All right. So that is that correction done and dusted. Once that's out of the way, Galen, I want to wish you a very, very happy New Start expiration day, February 5th, 2026, when we're recording. Congratulations. We have
thanks.
no more binding arms control agreements between the US and the Russians. Yay!
For the first time in over half a century, that is a correct statement dating back to
Yes,
the 1972 SALT agreement or SALT 1
that's right.
agreement.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, New Start, I don't want to oversell or undersell it. If you're a believer in arms control, uh, an important agreement for sure. It limited the United States and Russia to something like 1,500 or so deployable ICBMs, SLBMs, and strategic bombers. Um, strategic warheads on those platforms, and 700 of those deployed systems, as well as monitoring on non deployed platforms. So maybe not as big of a deal as some other arms control agreements, but of symbolic importance for the reason you just said, Steve, which is now there are no remaining major arms control agreements between the United States and Russia. And one of the things this deal was signed in 2010 that Obama had to do to get that agreement was to agree to this major nuclear modernization program, which we've
Mhm.
spoken about before. So things have really taken quite the turn. Uh, some people are thinking that with the this agreement lapsing, that arms control is now dead. We've talked about potential proliferation aspirants on the show
Yeah.
previously, which is not a short list. China has been building its arsenal out. Obviously, the technology keeps changing. Russia is boasting about this new Poseidon drone that can travel across an ocean and detonate a hydrogen weapon and cause a nuclear
Tsunami.
tsunami.
Yeah.
Um,
That's crazy. That's
so
like anime type stuff.
wild. And by the way, one way to defeat, if Trump is serious about this Golden Dome missile defense system,
Hmm.
one way to defeat it, among others. Now, it appears there might be some sort of gentleman's agreement that Moscow and Washington will continue to abide by the New START agreement.
Hmm.
But we're certainly a far cry from 2009 when President Obama talked in Prague famously about hopefully reaching a world without nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
The arrow is pointing in the other direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Axios has reported that American and Russian negotiators, I think in Abu Dhabi, have proposed a handshake agreement. Non-binding, but the Putin and Trump need to agree to it still to continue to abide by the terms of New START for the next 6 months while they hash out a new deal. I think the entire world would love to see that because we really don't need a new nuclear arms race. But like the elephant in the room here is what the Chinese are doing, and maybe in a future episode we'll get into Chinese nuclear modernization because that's a pretty interesting subject. Maybe we could have Professor Greenback on to talk about it.
Totally. And,
Yeah.
as he said on that episode we did with him, like, or I guess I said it and he was agreeing with it, was, unfortunately, arms control doesn't work when there are major political divisions between the
Mhm.
nuclear powers. And that appears not to be getting any better at the moment. So,
No, yeah,
we'll have to
they're
see.
loggerheads over Ukraine. That's not what this episode is about so much, though. We're going to basically talk about a problem that has been enabled by the expiration of sort of arms control being more of a spent force at this point. The war in Ukraine and the increasingly pointed questions about the American commitment to NATO. And that is what the Europeans are going to do going forward when it comes to having some kind of nuclear deterrent. So current state is that the US has extended deterrence via NATO over the territory of NATO members. And in fact, it maintains the force of about 100 American gravity bombs in, I think, 6 military bases in 5 different NATO countries. It's Italy, it's Germany, it's Turkey, it's Belgium, and there's one more in there I'm not remembering.
Italy and the Netherlands.
Netherlands, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Netherlands. And these are carried, first of all, they're under the control of the U.S. Air Force, and they cannot be deployed without the U.S. Air Force being involved. But they are deployable on like NATO standard aircraft, U.S. aircraft, basically flown by NATO members. So this is the F-35 aircraft, maybe some of the other fighter bomber models that are in these inventories. There's only 100 of them. And they're basically obsolete technology from the 1960s. They've been modernized somewhat. The problem is if the Europeans or NATO were to get into a hot war with Russia and it escalated to the nuclear level, Russian air defenses could bring down those planes before they could deliver these bombs, right? So that's the current state. And that is before we even get to whether the Europeans trust the Americans anymore. And they don't, which is part of what we talked about last week, right, Caitlin?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say up front, like, no one knows how this is going to play out. And NATO has seen some pretty significant crises in the past, including ones related to nuclear force planning and nuclear doctrine. That said, my own sense is this one does seem more severe. And at a minimum, I think the Europeans would be foolish not to begin having discussions, which they already have started doing that to some degree over the past few years, about what a potential post-American NATO or a NATO where the United States is not playing its traditional role of providing its extended nuclear umbrella, what that looks like. And whether that actually comes to pass or not, we are not making any judgments, but certainly If you are the leader of a country within the alliance, U.S. credibility and U.S. commitments do not seem as credible as they did in the past. And so it's a discussion that I think is worth having.
Absolutely. As you said, the Europeans are now having it. And about 9 months ago, this got a lot more concrete when the UK and France announced a new agreement, a new joint agreement, the Northwoods Agreement, whereby they declared that there is no extreme threat to Europe that would not prompt a response by our two nations. And these are, by the way, the two European countries that maintain an independent nuclear deterrent. Now, that word independence is really important, and we can talk about whether the UK actually has an independent nuclear deterrent because it is minimal and it is basically governed completely by US technology. What is it?
Trident missiles.
Thank you, Trident. I was going to say Triumph missiles. It's something else. Yeah, on nuclear submarines. So it requires American participation and that's not truly a independent nuclear deterrent. France's nuclear deterrent is independent, but between the two of them, they've got about 500 warheads against Russia's 5,000. And also importantly, neither of them has a full triad. So the UK is down to just submarine launched ballistic missiles, those Trident missiles, while France has SLBMs and nuclear cruise missiles that can be launched from fighter bomber aircraft. Neither of these countries deploy ICBMs or land-based nuclear deterrents anymore. So they don't have the full triad and they just don't have that much capability, right? But they are trying to step into the vacuum that is being left by the drying up of American credibility here. So the agreement went on to say, the Northwood Declaration went on to say nuclear forces remain independent but can be coordinated. There's now a new UK-France nuclear steering group led by the Élysée and the Cabinet Office. So it's the highest levels of the security establishments in those two countries. And in December 2025 in Paris, officials from the UK observed France's POCR, it's the codename POCR, Strategic Airborne Nuclear Exercise, where they exercise these Rafale jets in a sort of mock nuclear bombing run, basically, as I understand it. So they're trying to demonstrate that these arsenals are linked, the country's vital political interests are linked, and they extend over the nuclear or the European continent. But this is a big job for small arsenals between two countries that frankly don't have that much capability, right, Galen?
Yeah, and I mean, a few more points just as we're building out what these arsenals look like. I
Yeah.
believe both countries decommissioned whatever tactical nuclear weapons they had,
Yep.
i.e. battlefield nuclear weapons, which we can get to why that's potentially significant, and not having that capability could cause issues in the event of a crisis where the United States is not involved. And just on this point you made about the UK deterrent not being fully independent, it would be very expensive and difficult for the British to build out their own missile capabilities indigenously. And moreover, I believe it's Lockheed Martin that does most of this work, but those missiles obviously have to be maintained from time to time. And most of that work gets done within the United States. And so in that sense, you could argue that that arsenal is not fully independent. And then the idea of kind of working around the United States by trying to make the British arsenal more compatible with the French one, that's different technology. And that would also take time and money to do that. So aside from the numbers being lower, not having the full triad, not having the full complement, including tactical nukes, that's a pretty significant issue on the UK side.
Absolutely it is. And like all of this sounds like, well, a lot of things would have to go wrong for this to be relevant, but we're talking about nuclear force structure planning. We're talking about nuclear war plans. And when we're talking about that, we're operating in the world of worst case scenarios. That's the whole point, right? So it's like, yeah, the US is still part of NATO. Yes, the US still has this nominal nuclear force in NATO. Maybe the US would step up in a real crisis, but you don't want to hear the word maybe when you're talking about like nuclear warfare planning. It's got to be definitely. And the US went to very great lengths during the Cold War to make absolutely sure that everybody understood that it would definitely respond. Definitely 100,000% chance of response if there were a crisis, right? And we are
And even
well under that now.
even then, people had real questions about whether those threats should be believed.
Yes, and the French had so many questions that they didn't participate. They developed their own technology at great expense, and they still maintain it. So, yeah,
It,
and so it's like they really the Europeans are they don't want to hear that there's any possibility that the US might not respond, and that's all that they've been getting. Especially after the Greenland fracas, right?
yeah, and in fact, which we've mentioned before, this whole saying, "Would the United States really trade New York for Paris?" That is attributed to Charles de Gaulle.
Yes,
That is sort of a French idea, or at least that's who it's prominently associated with.
that's right.
Um, so this is a major issue. I did want to briefly maybe talk just slightly about the history here.
Yeah, let's do
Um,
that.
so we've talked before. The United States did not have a full policy of opposition to European proliferation. Now, it did cut the British out, interestingly, after the Manhattan Project. The British made some pretty key contributions to the success of the Manhattan Project, and the United States, when the war ended, sort of was like, thank you, now you're on your own. But over time, particularly under Eisenhower, the United States recognized that once the Soviet Union was capable of threatening the United States with its nuclear arsenal, that it would create this serious extended deterrence problem. And even though the United States, as you said, went to great lengths to try to make those threats credible, there were question marks throughout the entirety of the Cold War about that. And even, I think as Brendan said on the show, or he and I discussed, like President Nixon at one point said that, the US nuclear umbrella for Europe was a lot of crap. Um, and
Some of
so
those secret tapes that are always getting him recorded and getting him into trouble, right?
look, man, bad for the country, great for scholarship.
Yeah, great for
I leave,
archival research, right?
yeah, I make similar points in the classroom sometimes. With bad for the world is sometimes terrific for teaching purposes.
Mm,
So, I mean, really what the problem that everyone encountered there was Germany.
mhm.
Ultimately, the idea that the Germans would have their finger on the nuclear trigger uh, was something the Soviets were not willing to accept and could be a cause of World War III. And so ultimately, the United States under Kennedy decided to keep its forces in Europe. And
Mhm.
that was the symbol of the US commitment. And this is why the NATO system worked, right? It kept the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down.
Yeah,
Um,
and there's a great diversity of nuclear weapons technology during the Cold War in Europe. We had, like, nuclear landmines, we had nuclear bazookas, we had nuclear artillery, we had suitcase bombs, all kinds of tactical stuff, short, intermediate range, long range, like, you name it, we had it, and it was all just pointed at Russia, right?
yes. And like I said, the Americans didn't necessarily think it was the worst thing that the British and French had their own nukes. I think Kissinger
Yeah.
tells the French at one point, like, it's not the worst thing that the Soviets have to worry about more than one nuclear armed enemy. Now,
Mhm.
the thing I really wanted to bring up here, because it's getting floated again as a potential solution, and I actually think it illuminates some of the difficulties of the problem more than provides solution. But this idea of what was called the multilateral force, or
Mhm.
the MLF, which I had a student last semester write a really terrific paper about, by the way. It starts under Eisenhower. It's kind of languishes under Kennedy and ultimately is killed off under LBJ. But you're seeing people talk about it more today as a potential solution here. And the idea was essentially to square this circle of not letting certain European countries, especially the Germans, get their hand on the nuclear trigger, but also not have this extended deterrence problem. And so the idea here was that you would have a fleet, basically, of surface ships and submarines that had nuclear missiles on them, and that they were mixed manned crews. And so you
Mm.
had individuals from different countries that were part of the alliance involved in manning these ships. And so it was seen potentially as a way to pool sovereignty over the nuclear arsenal. And perhaps that would be a way to make sure the Germans didn't get the bomb themselves, but also that you didn't have this extended deterrence problem. Bless it. It's ended up not working out for a variety of reasons. There were some financial considerations. The French, obviously, we were just saying, wanted their own nuclear capability. But fundamentally, the problem was you can't pool sovereignty unless you're willing to share command of launching those weapons.
Yep.
And the United States was never willing to surrender its veto, that it was going to be American bombs or American made bombs, and the United States was not going to surrender its power of authority over its arsenal. And so it was never going to be a truly Euro deterrent, so to speak. And so I actually think that problem illuminates some of the problems the Europeans are facing today in an interesting way.
Yeah. And the key question, again, always gets back to, are you going to yield control of the red button that might incinerate your capital on behalf of somebody else's capital? Are you going to hand that to your ally and be like, okay, like I'm ready to risk, right? And the answer when the chips are down is always maybe, you know? And so it's like, but there's many different levels of the chips being down. When the chips have never gone all the way down, right?
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood, right? But that's exactly the type of situation that we're talking about. That is exactly the type of planning that we're talking about. It's like how many different gradations can stand in between peacetime and full nuclear war. And there's many, many, many different escalation steps between them. And at what point does the ally get nervous and take back the red button?
Well,
right?
So there's another problem which we can get into more. So let's say that problem were overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a genuinely pooled sovereignty over command of this arsenal and had a truly so-called Euro deterrent in place.
Right.
In a crisis, time is going to be short. A crisis, almost by definition, means that the odds of war have gone up. And in this case, the odds of a nuclear war have gone up. What exactly does pooled sovereignty or pooled command over this look like? Is it a majority vote on whether to launch this arsenal? Does any country get a veto on doing it? Does the country that is going to potentially absorb a nuclear attack get more votes than one? You can imagine the bickering that goes back and forth when time is short. The United States famously has a system where one person, the president, has sole launch authority of the nuclear arsenal. And the main reason for that is it is supposed to make the threat more credible that the United States would actually resort to using its nuclear arsenal, and that time in a crisis is going to be short. You don't have time to be going to Congress and asking for a declaration of war or something like that.
By the way, this also applies to NATO. NATO has always had a supreme commander who is American, right? Which is why, without the Americans being fully credible and potentially just leaving, which we can see in view now, like we're probably closer than we've ever been to having the United States just leave NATO. Who steps up and provides that supreme command authority? Is it rotating? Is it shared? Is there a triumvirate? Like, yeah. Is it what full consensus like the European Union is? That probably doesn't work very well. It's a qualified majority. And missiles, by the way, are arriving in 15 minutes. So kind of need to figure that out before we get started.
Yeah. Well, all right. I wanted to flag this piece in Foreign Affairs from last summer by Florence Gaub. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Stefan Mayer. It's called Europe's Bad Nuclear Options.
They sound like they might be German.
Let's take a look. She is the director of the research division at the NATO Defense College, and he is director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So there you go.
We're going to get back to Germans in Germany in a little bit. Go ahead.
Well, I think this is a useful way to lay out a discussion framework here. They basically say the Europeans have three options in the event that the United States gets out of the NATO Europe business. You could have a French and or French British deterrent, as we just
Hmm.
discussed. You could have a true Euro deterrent, which would involve French and British nukes sort of falling under some more multilateral NATO or EU command. Or you could have nuclear proliferation.
Mm.
And the list of countries interested in getting the bomb is not short at this point. Ukraine isn't in NATO, but they have indicated they're interested in getting the bomb for obvious
They could sure
reasons.
use it. Yeah.
And, they certainly, I think, regret at this point signing the 1994 Budapest Memorandum when they gave
Yeah.
up their Russian nuclear weapons that they inherited when the Cold War ended.
That's a,
Poland is another
yeah.
one.
Yep.
The Poles have made a lot of sounds about this. Germany, we've talked about. So Turkey is a NATO country, and Erdogan has talked about this before. So those were the three options they laid out. And as their title of the article suggests, I don't think any of them are particularly good.
Yeah. So each option presents problems. So we can just go through the list, right?
Sure.
One is the shared or pooled British-French extended deterrence. It seems like the Europeans are starting here, which makes sense. They're giving this a shot.
Yeah.
There is now a mutual defense treaty between Poland and France, which is kind of interesting. It's like within the framework of Russia and the EU, they now have a bilateral agreement too. Very interesting.
I think Tusk said that potentially opened the door down the road to some sort of French extended deterrence commitment to Poland. So,
right. Yeah,
yeah.
and France, their nuclear force posture is meant to deter attacks on quote unquote vital interests, which it acknowledges has a quote unquote European dimension. But what does that mean? And what does that mean to the Poles, right? What does that mean to the Russians? Unclear, not relevant outside the framing of a crisis, but very relevant. That would have to become concrete very quickly. But we are seeing different countries in Europe starting to make noises about maybe hosting more French military assets, potentially, maybe doing more joint exercises with the French and the British. This is important, right? Nuclear sharing. But is sharing actually good enough when the chips are down?
It depends on what the sharing is, right? I mean, there's these different scenarios that get, like one country supplies, let's say, the aircraft, but they don't have command on launching them. I guess that's a form of nuclear sharing. Is that good enough if you're the country that doesn't get the final say over what happens?
Yeah. And so ways of like starting to extend into the vacuum could include a European nuclear planning group, because there is a NATO nuclear planning group, and that involves the United States and I suppose Canada as well. Just recreate that at the European level with France and UK as the anchor powers, right? So starting to talk more with the other countries and plan more about different scenarios, release plans and war games for these types of scenarios. That's one way of like starting to create a little bit of capability. It's like we have the ability to do this if we wanted to, ... should this happen, right? And there are some joint exercises now between the European powers that do not include the United States, which I think is pretty interesting. And so there's this set of exercises called Steadfast Dart that actually just occurred in January 2026 without U.S. participation. These were led by Germany, and 11 NATO members participated, including the UK, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Bulgaria. There were 10,000 troops with ground, air, naval, cyber, and space components. And this was to test the Allied reaction force and demonstrate European self-reliant defense capability. Now, it's not clear to me whether this included like mock nuclear bombing runs or anything like that, but this is the kind of thing that is now starting to happen. And it's just building up this muscle, assuring themselves, and then assuring everybody else that this is something that we are able to do. Getting them to believe that they will do it is the hard part, though, because you're not interested in actually fighting a nuclear war. Like, you want to be able to stop it from happening. You need to deter it. And so that's where the credibility piece of this comes in. And I think this sort of nuclear sharing model is pretty tough. So that's number one. Number two is the multilateral force, the European multilateral force, right? Also tough, but for different reasons, right, Galen?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is what we just said, which is what does that look like in practice, particularly
Yes.
in a crisis? Who works that out? Another one, which I guess you could argue applies to all three of these, but it seems particularly apt in this particular scenario. If the United States does fully withdraw, or to a great extent withdraws from Europe, do old security rivalries between the Europeans themselves
Mm.
reemerge? Can
Hmm.
you sustain security cooperation? These countries all have a long history that predates 1945. Um,
Hundreds and thousands of years.
and,
Yes.
some of them, not too difficult to name if you think about it for a second, have occupied one another in the past. Some
This is
of
where
them
the Germans come in.
some of them have killed millions of each other's citizens over the centuries.
Yeah.
And so how is that going to work? I mean, without giving the United States too much credit, right? The Germans themselves had agency and sort of confronted their history in the decades following World War II. Arguably, the spread of, liberal democracy had somewhat of a pacifying effect, but you could argue a lot of these things don't happen and are reinforced with the United States playing the role that it has in Europe since 1945. If you remove that variable, does it become a lot more difficult for some of these countries to cooperate on something as important as nuclear security, no less?
Which is
That's
the ultimate expression of sovereignty, right? It's the power of life and death over civilization on Earth, basically. That is the purest manifestation of sovereignty. And I think to your point, it's like, okay, in the hypothetical scenario where the US exits the NATO business and the European protection business, right now Russia is the big bad. And so I think that the smaller European powers can be scared and band together. That's right now. What about in the future? If Russia changes or breaks apart or is no longer an enemy or gets its own allies. Like France and Russia have a long history of actually being allied against the Germans and the Poles, right?
one other point that again affects at least the first two of these scenarios. Alliances and alignments shift. So do national governments.
Yes.
And, it's not out of the question by any stretch of the imagination that, say, Marine Le Pen becomes the next leader of France.
Or her understudy. It's not clear she can do it.
Oh,
legally.
right. Because
Bardella, I think his name is
Okay.
Jordan Bardella. Yeah.
Well, that party has already said they're not willing to sort of loan out the French nuclear arsenal, that it is a national arsenal that will only be used in the pursuit of French interests.
Yeah.
That's a major problem. If you're Poland, for example, and you're trying to work with Germany, Germany is a certain country now, but if you're Polish, you have certain memories.
Living memory for some people. It won't be living memory for much longer, but yeah, Poland really doesn't like the Russians right now, but do they fully trust the Germans? That could turn on a dime.
we've talked about the Alternative for Germany party, right?
Yes.
I don't think there's a danger imminently that they're going to win a national election, but I believe they are now the second largest party in the country. If you're Poland, you're obviously watching that. And whether it's because proliferation on Germany's part or this multilateral Euro deterrent option, that's going to, at a minimum, give you deep pause.
Yeah, especially because the Germans are rearming conventionally very, very quickly. And right now, that army is going to be under the control of Friedrich Merz, right? Who's a, standard small c German conservative, not a populist conservative or authoritarian conservative, but the AfD is waiting in the wings. And we've talked about those guys before. It's not exactly clear who they are or what they would do, but it does raise certain questions the new Bundeswehr is going to be under their control potentially. And certainly large German armies have caused problems for the Poles in the past.
Put it mildly.
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, right?
Two other points, by the way. So one, it's kind of an interesting debate. I have to think about it more, but on the one hand, if it is France and Britain, so we're back to scenario one, kind of
Yeah.
providing nuclear security for the rest of the alliance, that does not eliminate the extended deterrence problem.
No.
So even leaving aside, do the French want to share these weapons? Do they want the responsibility?
Mhm.
Someone like, the far right German or French party would not. But even if they did, you still run into all of the same problems that the United States has, only now you're working with a much smaller, less sophisticated arsenal. The second thing is, what if the Russians invade a country within the alliance that's in Eastern Europe? Say it's one of the Baltic states
Mhm.
conventionally, or say the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons. If you're France and Britain, or if it's a Euro deterrent, are you going to war over that? Particularly if it's going to put your own capitals at risk. Does that mean that the French and the British and everyone else should start investing in tactical nuclear weapons at significant levels? All of these problems we've had in the past still exist. The interesting debate is, does the fact that these are countries that are geographically more proximate than the United States and whose interests might be more directly impacted
Mhm.
make these threats more credible? That's a pretty
Right.
interesting question.
Credibility is sort of a multiplicative product of capability and credibility, right? So what you're saying is like increased credibility can make up for lack of capability. And so, yeah, France is obviously a lot closer to the Baltics or whatever than the United States is. The whole point of all of this is the United States has decided that it this doesn't matter anymore. Or it's having questions about whether or not this matters anymore, and that's almost the same thing as deciding that it doesn't, if you're European, right? I think we should talk a little bit more about the German special role in all of this, because they have never been trusted by anybody, including themselves, to have nuclear weapons. The what was it, the 4+2 agreement that
Yes.
facilitated German reunification explicitly forbade them from ever pursuing a nuclear arsenal.
And they
And
are a signatory to the NPT, which,
yes.
if
So
you've
they're
studied
doubly committed, right?
if you've studied the history of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, by the way, it was pretty much a treaty that creates a nuclear cartel among nuclear haves and have-nots. Kind of interesting treaty, by the way, explicitly discriminatory. But if you studied the history of it, you know that it was mainly aimed at West Germany
Yep.
and making sure that they did not get the bomb. That's sort of the origins of the treaty. So it goes back well before 1990 with German reunification. But yes, that commitment was restated in that 2+4 agreement.
Yeah. So Germany has the technical capability to go nuclear pretty darn fast. It is legally constrained. Merz has said that, like, there's no way his government would ever do it. If a German government who ignored international law or didn't care about international law were to come to power, they could get like at least a minimal arsenal probably within 6 months to a year. Same as Japan, same as South Korea, a lot of these countries. But Merz is also starting to say things like, yeah, we can't build our independent capability, like we're constrained and we don't want to. But perhaps we could host French weapons and maybe pay for the privilege. We have a lot of money and we're rearming conventionally. Perhaps we could pay to modernize the arsenal or like develop new technology and basically work through the French or the British in order to get an arsenal in Germany that is not German, but is kind of German. It's kind of the way I read this. It's like, yeah, no, it's French, UK, or whatever, but it's like it's in Germany, and like there's going to be Germans around, so it's like this weird loophole that I think is kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean, and like safety and command and control have obviously gotten a lot better with things like permissive action links.
Sure.
But this does remind me of the 50s when the Eisenhower administration was not supposed to share American nuclear weapons with the Allies and found clever ways that were pretty straightforward of doing just that while still technically being, in step with the letter of the law. It's like some of these safety mechanisms used to be like combination locks. Get
Right.
a
Oops.
get a bolt cutter, or
Yeah.
like the American defending the aircraft that had American bombs on it with a German pilot was defending it with like it was a single sentry with like a rifle
Nice. Yeah.
um, on a base surrounded by German troops.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that's what the Germans are doing here, but like this is important to remember as you're thinking about it's sort of German, but sort of not German.
Yeah. Exactly. And by the way, like this is inchoate. Like these conversations are really just starting. So there's the German angle to this. And Germany, if it fully rearms, it will be the most powerful conventional force outside of Russia and I suppose Ukraine now in Europe. So I mean that could present problems if you don't fully trust the Germans to begin with. And then there's Poland, right? Who is also talking about this. Now the Poles don't have any reactors, as I understand it, and they're not going to get any until the mid 30s. So it'd be, I think, more difficult for them to pursue an independent nuclear capability. They're also an NPT signatory, and they're pretty close to Russia. If Russia were to like locate a clandestine nuclear facility in Poland, you'd have to imagine that they would be striking that facility, same as in Ukraine, right?
I mean, so this like there would be a window of vulnerability that you would have to pass through with any of
Yeah.
these countries. There have been some proposals like the French and the British could either extend deterrence or like loan out their nukes while these countries built up their own indigenous nuclear programs.
Or sell them,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, all very provocative nevertheless. And like,
Yeah.
I can think of few things that would make the Russians more upset than Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. Again, Ukraine not in NATO, but for obvious reasons, an important part of the discussion now. Those countries trying to get their own nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's a recipe for pretty much instantaneous war in Europe, right? And they've let it be known that this is the case. I raised the prospect of sale because there's some evidence that Saudi Arabia has agreed to buy some part of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, and they have some kind of bilateral agreement now.
They signed a formal defense pact, I think,
They
a few
did.
months ago. But the rumor that's always been around, going back, I think, to the 80s,
Yep.
when Pakistan was, first really building out its own nuclear program. I don't think it's ever been confirmed, but there have been rumors, and I've seen it cited in many articles, that the Saudis might have paid for that with a promise from Islamabad that in return, like in a crunch, they could call on Pakistan for those nuclear bombs in a crisis. Maybe the Europeans could think about something like that.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe they could. To me, going back to the point that this is the ultimate manifestation of sovereignty, like what we're talking about right now is really the acid test as to whether Europe or the European Union qualifies as a state. Right?
No, and I don't think it does.
The answer is right. The answer right now today is no. Right? And it may never get the chance to do this, to create a European force, a shared multilateral force. Right? But this could be a forcing function that would prove that the European Union is actually a state, and which is conspicuously is not at the moment. Like, and they're like, it's not even clear that Europeans want the European Union to be a state. They may feel more threatened by their immediate neighbors than they do the Russians. Like, there's not consensus enough for this. But like that really gets to the key question as to whether Italians would go to nuclear war for French, whether French would go to nuclear war for the Poles, and on it goes, right? If you're all European and you're going to nuclear war for other Europeans, that makes more sense, right? If you're still talking about an independent French arsenal for independent French reasons, which is probably what we're still talking about, then the Europe doesn't qualify as a state.
Yeah, I mean, I will be the pessimist in the room and say I don't foresee that happening in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think it's pretty unlikely, right? But
well, it's like I'll just a few off the top of my head, right? Like we are still less than a decade out from Brexit, so the British went the other direction on that one.
They're regretting it, by the way, but yes,
for sure, as everyone told them that they would. But many people told us we would regret electing Donald Trump, and we did it twice.
Yep.
Turkey has not been allowed into the EU for a variety of
Hmm.
reasons. It is a member of NATO, but I think Turkish EU membership, that debate fizzled about 20 years ago. And I'm not sure Turks themselves want to be in the EU at this point. There was an interesting thing in that article you sent me from The Economist about like Sweden talking about a Nordic deterrent, not talking about a European deterrent, but like a
Yeah.
Nordic nuclear arsenal. That itself is sort of indicative of not wanting to spread it to the whole of the continent.
Well, if
And
you think about it, it makes more sense just intuitively and is probably more credible for Swedes to start a nuclear war on behalf of Finland than it does for them doing it for Greece,
yeah,
right?
but that's kind of my point.
Exactly.
Um, speaking of Greece, Turkey and Greece famously don't
Uh,
exactly get along.
Not exactly.
Um, and like we just mentioned all of this real deep history, and this is to say nothing of the effect this would have on the Russians.
Mhm.
So I just don't see that happening anytime soon. I think of the three bad options we've discussed, the one that sounds the most likely to me in the short term is either a French or Franco-British deterrent.
Yeah.
And further down the road, proliferation. I think the multilateral option is, in some ways, in theory, the most attractive, but in practice, the least likely.
Yes, and I would further say that if we go the proliferation route and the NPT regime breaks down, then we will see many countries get nuclear weapons. The consequences could be dire, shall we say, depending on how it is managed. One hopes that it would be managed conservatively and carefully, but like that's not really European history, is it? And it would probably preclude the creation of a European superstate. It's like having all those arsenals around. So it's like, to a certain extent, I do see this as a one-way door that the Europeans might be standing at. Whether or not they recognize it as such remains to be seen. But there are definitely European decision makers who are aware of this problem and trying to come to grips with it. They just might not be close enough together to be able to step through. And if they can't do it, then they're going to have to step back. It's kind of the way I think about it. Remains to be seen what will happen.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a good point to just make the broader point, which at this point should be fairly obvious. Like, look, there are all sorts of criticisms one can make of NATO, and I actually welcome some of the pressure that the administration has put on Europe to increase
Mm.
its defense spending and do more burden sharing. And it is true that at the outset, you know, the US never intended to stay in Europe permanently.
Hmm.
And we could have a debate on the wisdom of doing this. But what the US is losing here is a few things if it continues down this route, which may or may not be outweighed by other benefits. But one of them is the US sort of gets to call the shots
Hmm.
as the undisputed leader of the alliance, which has certain benefits. But the other one is like all of these thorny problems sort of melt away
Hmm.
under the US thumb of being the leader of the alliance and sort of shouldering the burden, especially of nuclear deterrence. And so, once that thumb is lifted, it's kind of anyone's guess where things go from here.
I certainly don't know, but we like to talk about this stuff. Awesome. Let's leave it there for this week. Another great episode in the can. If you like what we do, remember to like, share, subscribe, leave comments, all that good podcast stuff, But for now, this is Steve and Galen signing off for Global Tantrum. Thank you.